Hello friends, Dr. David Katz, another COVID reality check, and I'm going to call this one Strains of a Long Pandemic. First of all, apologies that it's been a while. There are really two reasons for that. The first, my contemporaries may remember Mr. Ed, the famous talking horse, who would only speak when he really had something to say. And I try to be the same. And frankly, you are not suffering from a want of information and opinion about the pandemic. You are suffering from an infodemic. We all are. It's information overload. So just adding noise to the din is not helpful. Try to wait till I think I really have some novel perspective to contribute. And with regard to strains of a long pandemic, I think I now do. And then the second reason for the lapse, and again, my apologies for those of you who thought I disappeared again, is one of the strains of a long pandemic, namely, ultimately you get the infection, which is what I've done. I thought I had it, as some of you may recall, about a year ago. I tested negative at the time. Maybe it was a false negative, but now that I've clearly gotten COVID, probably was something else, I'm not sure what. This is a definitive case of COVID. The other 4 people in my household got tested. They all tested positive. We all had exactly the same symptoms, including complete loss of olfaction. Everybody else's has come back. Our 3 adult kids who got this fully recovered. They had quite mild infection. They felt crummy for a few days, but that was the worst of it. My wife's a few days ahead of me. Her olfaction is now about 80% back to normal. Mine is at most 10%. Completely disappeared, by the way. It really, it's an amazing experience. It turns off like a light switch. I don't feel fine yet. I'm more than 2 weeks out. I'm still subject to intermittent fatigue and what my wife and I have taken to calling creepy COVID headaches. Those of you who have had COVID probably know what I mean. Those of you who haven't had COVID, I hope you never find out. But it's a unique kind of headache, unlike anything I've ever experienced before. So I've been a bit wiped out. Nothing serious. I've mostly been working, had a few days in bed, but not pleasant. And, you know, by the way, a mild infection is still no fun. And while I have been an advocate throughout the pandemic of letting young, healthy people get this and get over it as a way to return to life as we knew it before, that's no longer the best option when you have effective vaccines available that are going to make you substantially less sick than the native infection and confer immunity that's at least as good. So it's definitely a different world with all these new vaccines available, and I'll comment on the vaccine shortly. But back to my topic, strains of a long pandemic, my first meaning of that is the most obvious one, the issue of all these different viral strains. The first reality check I want to offer there resumes a topic I started addressing last time, and that is the development of multiple viral strains is exactly what we would expect. This isn't magic. This is not malevolence. This is basic math, and let me give you some simple numbers. And as ever with these videos, I'll attach some relevant citations, including one recent preprint that looks at the number of viral particles on average per person infected. I'm actually going to use lesser numbers. Let's say that every person who gets infected with COVID has at least 100 million viral particles. That's actually a very, very low estimate. And let's say that hundreds of millions of people around the world have now been infected. They clearly have. But let's simplify that number as well and just say 100 million. So 100 million people with 100 million viral particles. That math translates to 10 quadrillion, which is more than 1 million times the human population of Earth. So for starters, random mutations in a population of 10 quadrillion can do an awful lot of really funky things. Most mutations, most random mutations are either neutral because they're very, very minor, or they are disadvantageous because any creature existing in the world is adapted to exist in the world. And any change from the balance of adaptation is likely to be in a less favorable direction. So advantageous mutations are very rare. If they were anything other than very rare, we'd be seeing many, many more viral strains, because all of the mutations that are happening would result in strains that outcompete current strains. They're quite rare. So, if we have half a dozen or a dozen or even 100 viral strains, it's out of a denominator of, for starters, 10 quadrillion, 100 million times 100 million. But actually, that number doesn't do justice to a pandemic, because unlike us, our lifespans are 100 years, and we have generations every 25 to 30 years. That's how we essentially replace the human population at that very slow pace. The lifespan of viral particles is hours, at most days. So you have multiple complete replacements of a population of 10 quadrillion, and actually it's a much bigger number than that, but that'll do. You have multiple replacements every day. So it's not 10 quadrillion, it's 10 quadrillion times the repetitions of 10 quadrillion. And with each new population, each new cohort of viral particles, any mutation from the prior generation that confers an advantage will start to outcompete the others. No magic, no malevolence, just basic viral math. This is to be expected. No surprise here. Always happens, and frankly, the frequency of mutation and, excuse me, lingering COVID, and the frequency of new strains developing and starting to prevail is simply a matter of how many people are infected and, of course, how long the pandemic goes on. That's another factor. So you have 10 quadrillion, and again, that's a very low estimate. You have multiple generations every day. That's also a fairly low estimate. But you then have the fact that the pandemic's been going on for more than a year, and over that entire time, more and more people have been infected, more and more viral particles have been produced. Every one of them is potentially subject to mutation. You get to the point where a vanishingly unlikely occurrence of advantageous mutation is all but inevitable, just because the numbers are so incredibly, mind-bogglingly vast. So here we are. Almost everything you are hearing and reading, because almost everything I am hearing and reading, and I'm trying to keep up with you, if not a step ahead when I can be, about the viral strains, is speculation. And let's be honest with one another. Speculation is a fancy word for guess. So, maybe the viral strains will not be covered by the vaccines. Well, most of the evidence we have suggests that they are, at least to some degree, if not perfectly. There is now some early evidence that the South African strain you've been hearing about is at least partially resistant to the protections of one of the vaccines. I believe it was the Moderna vaccine. But most of what you're hearing is speculation. And by and large, the mutations that produce viral strains are variations on the same basic theme of SARS-CoV-2, and a good vaccine is really protection against the theme. So what I can do is tell you, one, data will be much better than guesses, and you have to be patient. If you want data-driven insights, you have to wait for the data to be collected and analyzed. That's not instantaneous. So one general caution about the infodemic: you're always going to get guesses. Now, some of them are quite expert guesses, to be fair to some of the people who are opining. They have rarefied expertise, but still, an expert guess is just a slightly better guess. It's still a guess. Experts need data to inform our ruminations, and until we have those data, it's informed guessing. So if you want better than that, you have to be patient. The first round of information will always be speculation, and all of that speculation will be played for all the drama it's worth by the media. You already know this. I've lamented this before, but on and on it goes. And so maybe the viruses will now navigate around the vaccines, and maybe after you've had COVID, you can get one of the other strains, and maybe. And, inevitably, it's not just bad news, although it's mostly bad news because that's where the drama lives. If it bleeds, it leads. but it's actually both hyped bad news followed by hyped good news. So comfort the afflicted, afflict the comfortable. We get both of those. So first you get afflicted with, maybe the strains will prove resistant to the vaccines and prove resistant to prior immunity. And then you get good news about the fact that, no, actually it looks like people who've recovered from COVID are unlikely to get a second infection, or it's not likely to be as bad. Anyway, be careful about that first round of information speculation. Fancy guesses, maybe better than nothing in some cases, but maybe not, frankly. I think there are times we'd be better hearing nothing for a while. The idea that there has to be news about COVID every 20 seconds actually fuels the unhelpful drama that tends to prevail. But, here I am, here you are, so presumably you're interested in my informed guess. My informed guess is the following. The vaccines will be at least partly protective against all strains because all strains are, in fact, variants on a common theme. If you have a vaccine against SARS-CoV-2 that is totally non-protective against some new strain, that new strain is a new virus. Can that happen? Yeah. Can you have such an extreme change in the virus that it's actually a new pathogen altogether? Yeah, but that's the next pandemic. That's not this one. I'm not sure we ought to be flying to worries about a pandemic we don't yet have before we get through this one. Let's focus on the one we have. That's a radically hypothetical worry that we're going to have a completely new virus and a brand new pandemic before ever we manage to get out of this one. Okay, maybe, but probably not. So vaccines, all of the useful vaccines will be useful to one degree or another against all the strains. It may be a lesser degree of protection depending on how radical the mutations are. And I feel even more strongly about native infection. And we have great evidence to inform this. So again, a good speculation is more than just a guess. If you don't have current data, at a minimum, it's an expert guess informed by precedent and analogy. And so that's what I'm trying to do. So consider, for example, seasonal influenza. The reason that we're all prone to it every year, the reason that there is an annual vaccine rather than, get it once and done, is because that virus too is subject to mutations that produces effectively new strains every year. But they are variants on a common theme. They're just new strains. They're not completely new viruses. And so the immunity we have from prior exposure to influenza is partially protective, which is why we don't have pandemic influenza every year. It's a rare event. And when we do wind up with pandemic influenza, effectively, we have a completely new virus. It's still influenza by name, but the mutations at that point are so extreme that it's a stranger to our immune systems. Even though we've seen influenza, other strains of it, many times before, this new strain is so radically different, it's unrecognized. It's like it's a completely new pathogen, and that's when we have pandemic influenza. So SARS-CoV-2 will be like that, and what that means is that exposure to any strain and infection with it and recovery from it confers a significant degree of immunity against all the strains. It doesn't mean you can't get infected, but it means the probability of infection is much reduced, the dose you have to be exposed to needs to be considerably higher, and the severity of infection is apt to be much milder. None of this is an absolute guarantee. There are always idiosyncrasies. Strange, bad things happen in medicine all the time. Some we can explain, some we can't. So again, none of this comes with a 100% worry-back guarantee, but I'm quite confident getting over COVID that I am immune and that I will have lasting immunity and that immunity will pertain to all strains to one degree or another. And if I encounter a strain different enough from the one I had, and by the way, we really are way behind, certainly in Connecticut, but in general in the United States, on doing genetic sequencing so we know who's getting which strains, where different strains are prevailing. And frankly, it is possible to ascertain with good epidemiology whether or not people who've been infected with one strain are subject to another, which strains you can get after having which other strains. All of that's work that can and should be done. I hope it's being done. We continue to be very far behind where we should be with overall epidemiologic surveillance, but we're doing better than in the early going. So that information should ensue. But at least partial protection is very likely. That leads to the single most frequent question I've been getting since I recorded my last video, and that is, what's your view on getting vaccinated if you've had the infection? Just a general reminder about my position regarding vaccines, and some of you watching this video and some of you corresponding with me routinely have sent me all sorts of precautionary literature about concerns about vaccines in general, about studies that show their limitations, their liabilities. I'm aware of all of that. When I tell you that I am a strong proponent for immunization, it's not because I'm oblivious to the counter-arguments. And I think that's really important. If you are vaccine dubious or vaccine reticent, you really don't want to hear from a zealot. Vaccines are the best thing ever. You want to hear from somebody who understands why you have concerns and still believes in the great value of immunization. And that's me. I've read the papers, I'm aware of the liabilities, and clearly immunization is not completely free of risk, whether it's an allergic reaction or some other adverse reaction. By the way, one of the concerns at the moment is a rare blood reaction, thrombocytopenia, low platelet count, which is being seen with, I believe it's the Moderna vaccine. So you introduce something novel, almost any exposure to a large enough population, and some people are going to have an adverse reaction. You know, if it can happen in response to peanuts, it can happen in response to a vaccine, and it does. But in medicine, all considerations are about risk-benefit trade-offs. It's not about getting to zero risk. Zero risk doesn't happen. Doesn't happen in medicine, doesn't happen in life. And you know, I've said this many times, and perhaps there's little value in repeating it, but there is risk involved in crossing the street. But you look both ways and you take your chances when you have a need to get to the other side. In medicine, the risks are generally higher than that, but it's a matter of what are the risks of doing nothing. So I am a vaccine proponent, both now and in general. Immunization is one of the great advances in the history of public health, and among the reasons why we're prone to vaccine reticence is because, A, it's easier to find information now than ever before in history. So if you are vaccine reticent, you will be able to Google your way to articles telling you about bad responses to vaccines. And that will play to confirmation bias. It basically, aha, I knew I was right. You'll find what you believe to be true. We're all subject to that. And so that's problem A. Problem B is we are privileged, or at least we were before this damn pandemic, to live in a world mostly spared the infectious disease scourges that essentially ruined life in many prior generations. My parents routinely talk about the experience with polio and the worries their parents had every spring, and you know how devastating it was to be a kid who wanted to go swimming and your parents were just mortally terrified that you would get a devastating illness if you did, and so you couldn't go swimming. And so again, we don't get polio, we don't get smallpox, and that's thanks to immunizations. They really work. I'm a proponent. So you need to, I'm not going to go through the details of all the different vaccines. It's basically a moving target every day. Confer with your health professional when you are next in line. Find out about which vaccine is available to you, and we'll have more information with each passing day and week about how the different vaccines are performing and how they're performing against the different strains. Anything I record in this video would likely be obsolete by the time you're next in line anyway. So just in general, vaccines are good. And this is not a change of heart, by the way. I've always been in the middle. I advocated for letting low-risk people be exposed to SARS-CoV-2 early in the pandemic to essentially get through it, get over it, become immune, help themselves, because essentially that's the way for them, and I include myself in that group, to get back to a worry-free life, or at least free of worry about the pandemic. But also it's the path to herd immunity. But the reason for that argument, which by the way I made fully a year ago, I'll attach to this a piece I did on the concentration of risk in certain segments of the population, and a call for what I labeled decisive action. That was an acronym directing crisis services, DCISEV, directing crisis intervention services to the especially vulnerable, DCISEV. I'll attach that link. But that, that was in a world where we didn't have vaccines and we didn't know how long it would take to get them, and we were hoping it would be within 18 months, but nobody knew. That was also guessing. So in that world, I said, unless you want to stay locked down potentially for years, we really need to be thinking about risk stratifying the population and a rational approach to herd immunity. I still feel that that's absolutely correct. I recently was sent that link, my writing from a year ago, by a colleague who was saying, this looks to me spot on. And I hope it's not arrogance on my part or confirmation bias. Aha, I was right. But I wouldn't change a word. So my views have not changed very much. They've evolved to keep up. I've acknowledged when I've been wrong, like when the pandemic would end. But the basic approach still makes sense. The difference is there was only one way to get to herd immunity in the early going, and that was for people at low risk of bad outcomes to get infected and become immune. There's now another way, and that's the vaccine. All that needs to be true for the vaccine to be the preferable way is that the risks of vaccination, long-term complications, adverse reactions, are substantially less than those same risks associated with the germ. And that is clearly the case. It's not that vaccines are a panacea. It's not that vaccines are risk-free. They don't need to be the far better option. They just need to be far less risky than the infection. And again, everything I thought was true about COVID has proven true in me. So I speculated that, because of my general health, even though I'm 58, I didn't really need to worry too much. I didn't want to get the infection, but I figured no big deal if I do. And in the early going, I kind of did want to get it so I could be over it and be immune. As it happens, kind of like All Quiet on the Western Front, I got my case of COVID as the war was ending, as the vaccine was available. But it's not pleasant. So mild, yes. But I'm still waiting for my sense of smell to come back. It's pretty disconcerting to have that disappear completely. I'm still waiting for these creepy COVID headaches to go away. I'm still waiting for my normal energy level. It's only been a couple of weeks. I've got nothing to complain about. It's a mild infection, but still nasty. And I talked to colleagues who've had the vaccine, and at worst, they had a symptomatic response for several days and then felt fine. Well, frankly, that's better than being sick for 2 weeks. And you could argue, well, we don't know the long-term effects. Okay, yeah, but what's good for the goose is good for the gander. We don't know the long-term effects of COVID either. We know about COVID long haulers, so we know that effects for months certainly can occur. We don't know that's true of the vaccine, so that's a check in favor of the vaccine. But in neither case do we know anything about what happens years after exposure. And if you're going to worry that years after the vaccine bad stuff could happen, well, frankly, then you need to worry that years after exposure to the virus bad stuff can happen. And by the way, that's not that uncommon. I ran an integrated medicine center for 15 years where we specialized in the care of enigmatic diseases, hard to treat stuff, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and more often than not, when we probed, we found evidence of some remote viral infections, sometimes herpes virus, cytomegalovirus, other viral exposures, that the timing suggested was a precipitant of the development of chronic fatigue years later. So late consequences of infection, not all that uncommon. You've heard about chronic Lyme, which is usually not chronic infection, but a chronic syndrome because of the immune system's response to that pathogen. On and on it goes. And the last thing I want to do is give you more things to worry about. Rather the opposite. I'm saying the vaccine appears to be much safer than the bug, and so when it's your turn to get it, get it. Okay, back to that question then. What about vaccination post-infection? I'm now in that group. So I favor data over idle speculation. I conferred with colleagues who are expert in this space. The official recommendation, as you likely know, is everybody should get vaccinated even if they've been infected. But, frankly, when we first started hearing that, I thought there wasn't a lot of thought behind it. It was sort of a knee-jerk response. So I conferred with thoughtful colleagues who generally supported that, but there's been more and more speculation, that word again, that you don't need 2 doses of the vaccine following infection. You really just need 1 booster. And in my prowling to inform my response to those of you who asked me this question, I found one study out of Mount Sinai, not yet in the peer-reviewed literature. It's a preprint. I'll attach the link, of course, that specifically explored this issue. And what it demonstrated is that indeed a single vaccine, and this was the BioNTech or Pfizer vaccine, a single dose of the vaccine following native infection produces antibody levels as high or higher than 2 doses of the vaccine in someone who hasn't been infected. So essentially, the single dose vaccine is a booster following infection. So that it really comes down to the question, do you need a booster? And given all the concerns about new strains that may be partially resistant, the fact that you may have been infected with one strain but then get exposed to another, the fact that if you've been infected with one strain, there's nothing you can do about choosing the strain that infected you. I can't decide retroactively which strain I wanted to have so it would protect me against the next one. But with the vaccines, you can decide to adjust the vaccine so they cover a wider spectrum. You can introduce new antigens into a vaccine so that you are willfully protecting against more than one strain. And again, this is why I don't want to offer you detailed advice about which vaccine is best. That information is evolving every day. But my answer is yes, I think the booster makes sense. The booster makes sense because I will bump up my antibody levels in a few months' time when they're starting to fall, and they're still offering me protection, but a bit less. And assuming we still have high levels of viral circulation, a high level of protection will be a good idea. But second, because I want the longest lasting protection I can get, and I want the greatest breadth of protection that I can get. And my hope is that the vaccines will advance between now and then so that they're specifically covering these different strains. So again, I expect that native infection all by itself makes me immune, but immune is not an all or nothing phenomenon. It's a continuous scale, and that degree of immunity will vary with the degree of mutation, the number of strains, how different they are from one another. So, I will consider the vaccine an insurance policy to bump up my immunity to optimal levels, but I'm only going to need one. The other thing that you will note, as I noted, reading this good study about people being vaccinated following native infection, is that the reactions to the vaccine tend to be fairly unpleasant. You get a bit sicker. And the reason you get a bit sicker is because your immune system is primed to respond to SARS-CoV-2 antigens. Your immune system's already seen this bug, recognizes it as an enemy, and has a brisk response to it. You trigger that brisk response with the vaccine. So a first vaccine in someone who's never seen the bug, your immune system is relatively complacent, doesn't recognize the enemy. You develop antibodies, but it's a first-time response. It's mild. The second vaccine, which is a booster, people tend to have stronger symptomatic responses to the second vaccine than the first. People who are getting a single vaccine but who have had the infection tend to respond like somebody getting the second dose of their vaccine. So, I anticipate I'll feel kind of crummy for a few days. But again, talking to many people, many colleagues who've had the vaccine, it's a few days. So yes, I do think vaccination post-infection is a good insurance policy. Is it absolutely necessary? Probably not. Usually, native infection provides immunity at least as robust as any vaccine. Historically, that's been the case. Getting measles confers even better immunity than the measles vaccine, which is a very good vaccine. Historically, the best immunity has been you get the infection, you get over it, you recover. But again, we're dealing with a pandemic infecting hundreds of millions and perhaps well over 1 billion at this point around the world. And the proliferation of novel viral strains is occurring at an unprecedented scale just because the human population is bigger than it's ever been. It was vastly smaller 100 years ago. And that's the final comment I want to make today. Another little bit of math, just a reminder of my particular gripe about the infodemic and the tendency to over dramatize. I continue to lament the divisions in our society that seemingly obligate us to choose a tribe to the extreme left and act like anybody who doesn't acknowledge the sky is falling is a genocidal lunatic, or the extreme right, liberate my state, the whole thing's a hoax. Any sensible person at this point can see that both of those things are wrong. We've been living with the pandemic for a year, and yes, the toll has been terrible, but most people who came into this with reasonably good health are still with us. And the sky is not falling, and the world is not ending. It's bad, but it's not the apocalypse. On the other hand, it's bad, and it clearly deserves respect, and it's obviously not a hoax, and we probably all know people who've been infected. I've personally been infected. It's real, and it deserves our respect. That middle view really should pertain to the comparisons we make. And one of the themes I've noted in social media and the media in general is that if you dare compare SARS-CoV-2 to seasonal flu, the left, my usual tribe, by the way, those of you who lean left, I'm usually right there, but I just don't like the moral posturing and the sanctimony that's taken hold here. You are immediately assaulted for daring to contrast this terrible pandemic to common influenza. But the reality is that the global death toll at over 2 million from COVID-19 in over a year is something like 4 to 5 times worse than a fairly typical seasonal cycle of influenza. 4 to 5 times worse. Now that's a lot worse. That's a big deal. That's why this is a very serious pandemic, because influenza is bad enough. And by the way, it's not much worse than a bad influenza year. It's 4 to 5 times worse than a fairly typical influenza year. So 350,000, 400,000 people die around the world each year of influenza. 2 million dying of COVID makes it 5 times worse, maybe a little more. Okay, well then the argument is, so you dare not compare this to influenza, it's so much worse. And yet the very same camp that objects to comparisons to influenza has no problem comparing this to the 1918 pandemic. But this pandemic is, so far, unless it continues to worsen, and it looks like trends are starting to improve, less than 1/100th as bad as the so-called Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. Why? Well, because during that pandemic, about 1 in 36 people around the world died of the infection. 50 million people died. And it's not just that 50 million died, which is 25 times worse than 2 million people dying. And again, I always apologize when I use numbers and I'm talking about death, because I recognize these are real people and real families left behind to suffer these losses, mine included. So as ever, my condolences to everybody directly, personally, intimately, profoundly affected by this pandemic. I know you're in this mix, but you can't talk about patterns and understand them without using numbers. So 50 million people died in the 1918 pandemic. That's 25 times more than 2 million, but the population of the world at that time was about 1.8 billion. It's now 7.8 billion, so a fourfold difference in the size of the population. So 25 times as many deaths out of a population 4 times smaller is a 100-fold difference. So as bad as this pandemic is, it's 1/100th as bad. It's actually slightly smaller than 1/100th as bad as the pandemic of 1918. Just imagine living through that one. And yet the world did not end. People did live through it, and here we are all these generations later. So I'm not specifically saying let's all compare this to the flu, but I'm also saying it's really not valid to compare this to the pandemic of 1918, which was massively worse. All right, I think that pretty much covers the salient thoughts I have about these strains of a long pandemic. It is getting to be long, over a year. I continue to see light at the end of the tunnel, the combination of the pivot here in the northern hemisphere to spring weather not too far off now. We're not quite there yet, but that's next. The fact that more and more people have had the infection, which means more and more people have at least partial immunity, which means more and more approximation of herd immunity, and the availability of vaccines and an administration that is becoming more efficient at making them available. We've got miles to go, but we, I think, can all clearly look ahead and see our ability to traverse those miles and get back to the good stuff. So I'm quite hopeful, and I think we can bear these strains of this long pandemic, and I'll look forward to visiting with you again when I feel like I've got something worth saying. Until then, be well, stay safe.